In this video, I'll be demonstrating 7 different shading techniques that I use in my tattooing practice, as well as how to apply them. The needle depth varies between 0.5 and 1.5 millimeters, depending on the skin type and location, and this applies to all needles. The first technique I'll be covering is the push whip shading technique. For this, I use a 9 Magnum soft edge 0.35 needle. I adjust the needle so that it protrudes 2 millimeters from the needle module. Now onto the technique. As you can see, I hold the machine with 3 fingers and push it away from me. The needle enters the skin vertically, and by adjusting the depth of the needle with hand movement, a gradient is created. It's important to note that artificial skin is much tougher than real skin, so it doesn't absorb ink as well. Therefore, more passes are required on artificial skin compared to real skin, where fewer passes would suffice for a solid shading. However, for the purpose of this demonstration, we're focusing solely on technique. If you have any recommendations for good artificial skin, feel free to share them in the comments. This technique is great for working away from edges, but it can be challenging to create long, solid gradients. For beginners, combining this technique with a simpler design would be perfect, as it's easy to learn and can produce beautiful tattoos. As you can see, I've achieved a nice shading effect using only black ink, with the shading resulting from the depth of the needle. In practice, I've used this technique, for example, in the area shown in this tattoo. Now, let's address a common mistake to avoid. If you don't smoothly pull the needle out of the skin, you won't achieve a soft gradient, resulting in less satisfactory shading. Next, let's talk about the stipple, pepper whip shading technique, or whatever you want to call it. For this technique, I use a 7-round liner 0.3 needle, adjusting it to protrude 3 millimeters from the needle module. I set the voltage to the minimum level for this technique. Stippling shading involves inserting the needle into the skin and rotating the hand away from the needle's entry point on a rounded axis. You're doing it correctly if the needle can't enter the skin fast enough to make a solid line. Stippling occurs due to the fast hand movement. With decreased saturation, the further along an axis, the hand rotates. Of course, you can also use a pulling motion for this technique as long as the voltage is low and the hand movement is fast. I've tattooed this design, for example, using this technique. Using too high a voltage with this technique doesn't yield the desired result, as you can see here. For the scumbling shading technique, I again use a soft edge Magnum needle. With this technique, I make small circular motions, adjusting the depth of the needle with my hand movement to create shading. The slower the circular motions, the more solidly the ink is incorporated into the skin. Since I only want a light shading, I rotate the circular motions a bit faster. The texture created with this technique depends on the size of the circles and the pressure applied to the needle. This technique I often use in practice for dark backgrounds, such as in this tattoo at this particular spot. It's crucial to use a Magnum needle with rounded corners for this technique. Otherwise, visible edges may appear in the shading, as you can see here. Now onto the pull whip shading technique. Unlike the push whip shading, I don't push the needle away from me, but instead pull it towards me. A significant advantage of this technique is that it's less aggressive on the skin. Whenever you pull a needle, it's less aggressive on the skin compared to pushing it away, which can result in less skin trauma. It's not just with this technique. Generally, a larger Magnum needle yields a softer shading. In my opinion, this technique is perfect for creating light shading, like in this area of this tattoo of the King of Rock and Roll. Let's address another mistake to avoid. If you start too slowly and don't maintain a consistent movement, it can lead to a black spot where you initially started. Now, on to dot work shading. For this, I again use a 7-round liner needle. Here, I attempt to create shading from bottom to top with small dots. The shading is determined by the distance between the dots and the depth to which the needle is inserted into the skin. Generally, this technique is straightforward to learn and thus perfect for beginners. I'm curious if there are still viewers here who have been with me since the beginning of my YouTube journey. Feel free to write in the comments since when you've been following, and thank you for your support. If you're new to the channel, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel to not miss any further videos. I tattooed this design, for example, using this technique. If you go too deep, it can result in a blowout, which may not be immediately visible after tattooing, but becomes apparent once the tattoo has healed. You can see the principle illustrated nicely on paper here, showing what happens when you linger too long in the skin. This is cross shading. For the next technique, the needle protrudes approximately 2 millimeters from the needle module. With this technique, I shade in 2 different directions while holding the machine. To make it less aggressive on the skin, I also pull the needle towards me. The goal is to create shading that resembles a net. This technique is useful when the needle structure is visible in a shading. With the second pass in a different direction, you can blend it, resulting in a softer shading. This technique could also be done with a liner needle to create the cross-hatching effect, as you can see beautifully illustrated in this picture. Here, I use this technique. You can also create very soft shading with it. Now, let's talk about a mistake to avoid. It's important to keep the needle parallel to the skin. Otherwise, you'll get uneven shading, as you can see here. The best comes last. Pendulum shading. With this technique, I do the majority of my shading. This is how I hold the machine and move it evenly back and forth. I love this technique because it yields a soft shading in every direction, allowing for long, continuous shading. Even with round liner needles, you can tattoo this method excellently to create fine, detailed shading. In this design, I mainly applied pendulum shading. Unlike here, you should try to make controlled movements so that it results in a solid shading in the end. And if you want to learn more about my favorite technique, check out this video here.